Our next speaker is an expert burrito wrapper, having wrapped over 10,000 burritos. Please welcome Caitlin.
Thank you all so much for having me. I'm Caitlin Hudon. I'm a data scientist at Figma, and I'm here today to talk about making decisions with data. I think this is a topic that's probably near and dear to a lot of our hearts. And so I'm going to go a little bit through a framework that I've used that's helped to guide my work. And we'll start with the why here. Oh, this is getting cut off a little bit. Let me see if I can resize this real quick. Did that update? Let's see. That's okay. So we're going to start with an intake form, which actually came from this tweet or was referenced in this tweet. And so in this tweet, I was asking a question like, which is more important to stakeholders, getting an answer quickly or getting an accurate answer? And this came from a form that we used to start to clarify expectations around analysis, because we found that we were getting a lot of requests for analysis, but it wasn't very clear like how the analysis would be used, like what was the decision that people were trying to make, and how could we be most helpful. And so this form helped us to work with stakeholders in order to like set the table for those conversations. A couple of questions that were on the form. The first one was, describe your request. Like, let us know what is it that you're trying to accomplish. And then later on in the form, there was, what decision will you make or action will you take with this data? And one of the things that we started to realize was that the data requests didn't match the decisions that people were trying to make. And so they would ask for something very specific that was answering a question that was like part of what they were trying to get at. But in further conversation, we would find that maybe there was like another piece of data or another type of analysis that could be more helpful for them for making the decisions. And so we found that these conversations were really the thing that were most important. And so figuring out how to guide those conversations would be really valuable for our team, both like the data team and cross-functional people, so that we could come to conclusions like a little bit faster and better. So we got really good at asking these questions to gather some of the context. And the framework that I've put together here is taking years of asking those kinds of questions over and over again and putting it into a 5-step framework that we use to define the decision, define the data that we need to make the decision, and then use data to help inform the decision. And so you can summarize it a little bit like this. We're starting with the decision that we want to make and getting really clear on that so that we can put together like analysis or data in order to support it. And then we circle back to the decision and make sure that we're able to actually complete a decision with the data that we have. So the first step in the framework is to define the decision. This sounds really straightforward, but I think sometimes we'll get an ask and it won't be very clear, like, is the decision that we're trying to decide whether to ship or not? Is the decision that we're trying to figure out if we should run a test on something? Is the decision something else? And so getting really clear on like what the decision is that you're trying to make is the first step towards being able to use data to inform it. So that's the first question. What is the decision that you want to make? Really frame it up, get everyone on the same page with what it is that you're trying to decide. The next part to understanding the decision is understanding what are your options. And so maybe your options are that you ship something or you don't ship something. Maybe your options are tied to a timeline or something else. Getting clear on like what are the different options and how might data inform those options will help you when you go to do an analysis, because you'll understand the things that you're trying to optimize for. Which leads into the next one, which is, what is your goal? So if you're making a decision, you probably have a goal in mind or a thing that you're trying to optimize for or work with stakeholders to optimize for. And so getting everyone clear on what the goal is can be really helpful. I've sometimes walked into these situations where 2 different stakeholders are sort of asking for data science to help with something, and they have goals that are aligned, but maybe not exactly the same. And so understanding what a clear goal could be will help you to inform your analysis. Another one is, what does a good outcome look like? And so if we're thinking about an analysis, maybe a good outcome is making a decision very directly. Maybe a good outcome is reducing uncertainty, but understanding what will be the most helpful thing that you could bring with an analysis will ensure that the work that you do provides value to your team. Alternatively, it's also really helpful to know if there are outcomes that would be considered bad or unacceptable or must be avoided. And so if there's a particular outcome where your analysis is showing you that you might be heading in like a direction that is bad, that gives you the opportunity to come back to the table and say, maybe we should reframe this, maybe we should consider this other option. But understanding what kind of outcomes people are hoping for, I think is really helpful for finding early signs that may be confirming that in the data. So once we've defined the decision to be made itself, and we're able to answer all of these questions, we also want to be able to define some of the context and constraints. I find that some of the best decisions come from combining data with the context that we have like throughout a business. So we might know data says this. There might be times where there are things that like support that in other parts of the business. Maybe there's UX research that also kind of combines with the data, or maybe there are things that we know in the business that might contradict the data, or might be things that we need to consider alongside the data when making a decision. And so having an idea of what those things are before you do an analysis is really helpful so that you can start to talk to those people, you can start to understand those worlds, you can make a decision that's a lot more holistic and also inform your data analysis so that it's covering the parts that you don't already know as a business. So some questions you can ask here. Do you have a deadline? Like, is there a date at which this analysis would no longer be helpful? This is a mistake I've made in the past, like taking too long to do an analysis because I didn't realize that there was like a go or no-go date that's actually really important to hit. And so understanding if there is a deadline associated with it is great. Also, what happens if you don't meet that deadline? Like, are there very severe consequences? An example of this is like maybe you have a user conference and you're trying to get something out ahead of the user conference. And so if you don't meet that deadline, you might be waiting like another year for such a big stage to like do a release or put something forward. Or maybe there are alternatives that you can talk about if you don't hit that deadline that are worth knowing ahead of time. So all of this, again, is just to like inform the data work that you're going to do to help make data-informed decisions. Knowing whether your decision is reversible is really helpful. So I've seen this referred to as like a one-way door or a two-way door. And so a one-way door is a decision that you are not going to reverse. Sometimes pricing can fall into this category. And so knowing that upfront when you're doing the analysis can really help you to like frame those questions. There are times where if your decision is reversible and if it's something you could like A/B test pretty quickly and roll back, maybe you don't need to do the level of rigor that you might want to do for something that you absolutely cannot walk back and need to be very sure about. And so understanding more about the decision and what happens if things kind of go awry ahead of time is really helpful. What are your other practical constraints, like for the decision or for the process to make it? I've been in rooms sometimes where I've done an entire analysis only to find out that there was like an additional stakeholder who really should have been in the room from the beginning, who had really important perspective that maybe upended the impact or the intended impact of the analysis. So once they entered the room, their insights were so valuable and had so much business context that it completely shifted the lens in which we could use the data work that I had done. And so starting to learn about those things ahead of time so everyone can get on the same team and build alignment before you even get to data analysis is something that I've found super duper helpful. And so once you've cleared these two sets of questions, so clarifying the decision and then understanding the context around it, I feel like you actually have basically what we asked for in our intake form and hope to get to at the end of that first conversation, which is understanding the thing that you're going to do and how you can add value. So at this point, hopefully you have ideas about the kinds of data that you could be pulling or working with in order to make a good data-informed decision. So the next step is to determine the data needed. And so when we're thinking about a decision that we'd like to make, I think it's really helpful to frame the decision before we start talking about the data needed to inform it, because any of those things above shifting could change the kind of data that we're looking at and what it is that we care about or want to get out of it. So a few questions we can ask here. What information will help you to reduce uncertainty and make a good decision? And so outlining the things that you're uncertain about can be really helpful to decide like where to focus your time and energy in terms of doing data science or doing analysis. Another thing I recommend is, where possible, writing all of this down so that you have a record of the decision that you want to make, how you think data will support the decision. When you actually carry out an analysis, you can tie that into the additional context around it, and then even documenting like what the decision was. And having those artifacts will help you and your team to get better at decision making over time, because you'll be able to see past examples of patterns of decisions that you've had to make. And so you can see like patterns in the kinds of analysis that were helpful, or even patterns in the kind of context that it's helpful to gather. But knowing what will help you to reduce uncertainty is really important to inform the work that you'll do. We're getting into a few hypothetical questions that I love to ask. I find these to be ways to shortcut the analysis process. And so all of these are kind of putting things in front of stakeholders and seeing how they react to them. And so one question I like to ask is there data that would unequivocally tip the scale toward any given option? So if you saw that a certain number was like at a certain value, would that automatically help you to make a decision, yes or no? And if that is the case, that can save you a lot of time in analysis, because then you know you can go check that thing first. And if it's not where it needs to be, you can continue doing all the work that you need to do. But also it's a good way to kind of shortcut to the end. Another one is if you're leaning in one direction, what data would make you change your mind? And I really like asking these two things together because it's kind of like this turn and confirm hypotheses. Like if we have this hypothesis, and if there's one piece of data or one level at which we would say like, I don't know if we should make a decision like choosing A, we should probably look at B a little bit more, I find that to be super helpful. And then my favorite thing to do is hypothetically audition different data values. And so often stakeholders will have a specific thing that they're looking for. And so what I'll do is say like, okay, if you want conversion rate to be 50%, what if we find that conversion rate is 75 or 95 or 25? How would that change the way that we would make a decision? And being able to just like hypothetically talk about that ahead of time can set you up to do an analysis so that you're taking like the path of least resistance and getting to consensus in an aligned way a lot faster, because you already know what you'll do in these different what if situations. This is something I took directly from A/B testing best practices, where it's really helpful to know ahead of time, like lock in your predictions and the point at which you would turn something on or would roll back an experience. And so of taking that and applying it to decisions has been something that's been really helpful for me. This is a repeat slide. Reduce uncertainty and make good decisions. The next thing to do is to collect and interpret data. And so I think for a lot of the people in this room, we're probably doing that work ourselves. But once we know what it is that we're looking for and things that will be helpful for us to get there, it's time for us to actually go ahead and like find data and start to work with it. I'm not going to speak to this part as much because I think like this is so subject dependent. But a couple of quick notes. It's really helpful to tailor your analysis or exploratory work towards the questions that you've defined as important in order to make the decision. And so answering those questions clearly and documenting those answers is a really good way that you can see how your data helps to impact decisions. And then if you're not going to be doing the analysis yourself, or even if doing an analysis holistically requires you to work with other stakeholders, maybe even those are like other data scientists in different departments, sharing as much context as possible is something that I've found to be very helpful. I think we all know, like, if we're doing an analysis, we're making tons of micro decisions. That's why data scientists are so good at using data to inform decisions. Because if we want to decide, like, should I dig into this more? Is there a pattern here? We're doing this kind of calculation all the time. And so we know how much context can help to inform analysis and help a person to make the correct trade-offs or the trade-offs that are aligned to the way you're thinking about a problem. That's why I think it's so important to actually like share this pre-work with them if you're going to get additional people like working on the analysis portion of a decision. And then finally, make your decision. I think this sometimes gets left out because it can be a less formal process. Like often someone will read the results and then go or no go, and you might get a message in Slack. But there's not always a lot of documentation around this. And I found it to be super helpful to document all of the pre-work, all of the findings, alongside the actual decision that you make. And so that way, when you're looking back over your decisions, you have a feel for why you made them, what was the context, and maybe what you might do differently. I know for me, sometimes I'm revisiting parts of the product that someone else worked on like 2 years ago. And so the decisions that were made 2 years ago might not be the same ones that we would make today, just given the way that things change. And so seeing the decision that people were trying to make, the context around why, understanding the business context too, can be really helpful if you're looking back at like old analysis to see what may or may not inform your situation today. So I wanted to talk about some benefits of using a framework like this for you and your team. Starting with having a record of decisions and how data supported them. So it's really useful to be able to look back and see the role that data played in decision making, especially if you're making decisions that follow a pattern or are similar to things that you've decided in the past. If you can look back and see that historical context, you're able to understand a little bit more about like why the decision happened and how data helped to bring it there. You can also validate that your work will be used before you build. I really liked the talk from yesterday about answering product data questions and the importance of like reducing uncertainty and figuring out the value of the work before you take it on. I found this framework to be really helpful for that, because by talking to stakeholders ahead of time, I'm ensuring that the work I'm doing is answering the actual questions that will unlock the uncertainty that they need in order to like make a decision and do it effectively with data. This also leads to higher quality, more data-informed decisions because we're combining data with the business process. We're not just doing an analysis, handing off the results, and hoping that the things that we found get implemented in the best way. This is about being responsible for the work and being responsible for the translation of data into business context and how data can actually help to make the decision. And so I find it really helpful to be in the room and very involved in the conversations that are happening right up until the point of the decision so that I can make sure to advocate for the data, answer any follow-up questions that people have, and really ensure that the data is being used in the best way to set the context and build a holistic decision. And then making decisions more efficiently and effectively, I think, is the best thing that this process has brought to my work personally. And so being able to cut through some of the rounds of like, oh, I kind of thought you meant this, or I pulled this thing, which might help you inform this thing. This is able to shortcut some of those cycles of doing work. And so we all know that like data science isn't something where you prove one hypothesis and then you're just done. Often questions beget questions, and even analyses beget more questions. But being able to be on the same page about what it is that we're trying to accomplish has helped me to more efficiently navigate those loops, especially by proposing like hypothetical end values and what we might do in different situations. Gives me a way to like traverse that tree in the most efficient way. And then making decisions effectively. So as a team, if people get used to this kind of process and used to answering the kinds of questions around context that you'll have when you're doing an analysis, they'll be able to better tailor their requests and make the first process of like defining the decision more efficient because they have examples to work from and they kind of know what it is that you're going to ask them. So over time, using this in an organization helps to up-level the people around you so that they understand the kinds of considerations in data that you might have. Some of the ways I've seen this work are things like maybe we have specific questions that we always ask about our data. Like maybe we care about paid users and free users, and maybe we look at those populations separately. Or maybe we have specific quarters or times of the year where we might choose to like include data or exclude data from that time. So if you find yourself asking the same questions over and over again, I think putting that into a more like formal conversation or putting it into an artifact can be really helpful for people to know that those questions are coming. And it just gives them a little bit more pre-work to do that makes your conversations a lot more productive. So you can just get to alignment. And that's it. So if you want to get in touch, my website is caitlinhudon.com, and you can find like a contact form there. I'm also online pretty much every platform at Beyond a Posey, and happy to chat there too. Thank you.